Yo, so I make stuff like this using Adobe Fresco, and I get a lot of questions. So today I'm just gonna walk you through my full step-by-step process, and hopefully I can answer some of your burning questions along the way. Now, this is just my personal process that works for me. If you have a process that helps you make super dope art and have fun doing it, awesome. But if you're new to digital art or you are just looking to branch out and explore some new options, this video is for you. I've used this process to create art for companies all over the world, so if you're looking to do something similar, I think I'm someone that you can hopefully trust. There is absolutely no right or wrong way to make art, it's all just personal preference. And if you're curious about why I use Adobe Fresco specifically, you can check out my last video. I go in a lot more depth about that there. By the way, I'm Leia, also known as Low in the Flow. I am a full-time illustrator based on the North Shore of Maui, and I create really detailed line art illustrations that are inspired by my love for surfing and Hawaii with a bit of an edgy punk rock twist. Alrighty, get caffeinated and situated and enjoy the video. That was a little risky with my left hand. Alright, so getting started, I have been loving to just get my rough idea out on a super small scale, like sketching on a sticky note, just to map out where I think everything should go and get a clear idea of my composition before I start on my real sketch that's to scale. Okay, so getting started on my sketch in Adobe Fresco, I love to use the pencil brush, which can be found in the sketching category. And I always love to sketch in a dark teal color. I don't know why, it just feels right. It's a lot more fun than drawing in gray. I really like this pencil brush, and my favorite part is that it gets darker with more pressure, so you can sketch really lightly, and then you can also go over top of your light sketch with a little bit more pressure to darken up those lines and really decide which part of the sketch you want to define more. As you can see, my sketches start with super basic shapes and literal stick people. This is just what works for me to help map it all out, and if your first sketch doesn't look like crap, then you're doing something wrong, in my personal opinion. After I go in with some super sloppy basic shapes, I will add another layer and sketch in a more refined way, adding in more details and making it more of a roadmap for my final design. And if I'm just drawing something for me, I'll keep it pretty messy because I don't need anything too refined, but if it's a sketch that a client needs to approve, I'll make it very neat and very clear to them what the illustration could look like in the end. And for me, some things do need to be a little bit more sketched out, like my skeletons, for example, but something like leaves and palm trees, I could just draw with my eyes closed. Well, maybe not that, but I draw them all the time and they're a little bit more fluid, so those I can keep a little bit messier, for example. And this is just a time lapse that I've exported from Adobe Fresco, so if you didn't know you could do that, it's super easy and fun to have on hand. I think the number one question that I always get asked is, what brush is that? What brush are you using? Everyone wants to know about my freaking brush. So my brush is actually extremely simple. I just tweak one or two settings and then it's good to go. I always start with the round brush that can be found in the vector brush library. And all I do is adjust the beginning and the end taper, usually somewhere around 65%, but I'll change it depending on the look that I might be going for. And then I just jack the smoothing all the way up. The smoothing is what helps you get those really crisp and smooth lines. If you want your pen to be a little bit more responsive or have less lag, then you can just turn that smoothing down. And for pressure dynamics and velocity dynamics and shape and outline and all that, I just keep it at 0 the way that it is. I don't touch any of that. I just adjust the taper and I jack the smoothing all the way up. That's all that I do. I like working with a nice tapered brush, but find a brush that works for you for your own art style. Alright, I have got my final sketch in Adobe Fresco that I'm going to use as a map for my final line art in all of my colors. Now for this one, I ended up sketching on multiple different layers, so I'm going to go ahead and group those together, but you could also just merge the layers into one. And then I'm going to turn the opacity down, that way it's just a really light sketch that I can draw over top of. I start by grabbing my favorite line art brush and just testing out a few sizes to see which one is going to work for me on this piece. I usually grab a brush that is somewhere between a 17 and a 25 in size, but it really just depends. Visually, your brush size is relative to the size of your canvas, so a size 20 brush is going to look a lot different on a 10 by 10 inch canvas than it's going to on a 20 by 20 inch canvas. And I'm primarily using vector brushes, so the size of my canvas doesn't really matter in terms of quality because it can be infinitely scaled. But if you're going to be using a lot of pixel brushes, you're going to want to opt for a canvas that allows you to get as close to 300 ppi as possible. PPI stands for pixels per inch, so the higher that number, the higher the quality of your overall image. And if you're like, what the heck is vector brushes and pixel brushes and what is the difference, then you should go check out my last video, which breaks that down in a lot more depth. As I'm working on this monstera here, you'll see that I drew my lines past where they should be going. Sometimes if I'm trying to get an extra accurate line, I'll pull it out a bit longer, then just go in and trim the intersecting lines afterwards using vector trimming, which can be found if you double tap the touch shortcut. The touch shortcut is a little circle floating around your screen, and if you don't see it, go to settings and toggle touch shortcut on. When you have a vector brush selected, you can go ahead and draw some intersecting lines, and then tap your touch shortcut until it has a blue ring around its perimeter. Then you're in vector trimming mode and you can go ahead and just slice away these intersecting lines that you want to disappear. As you can see, I love to work pretty zoomed in. I just like to get really detailed while still keeping everything precise. I love that with vector brushes I can zoom in super far and not have to worry about everything looking pixelated either. I asked you guys to ask me some questions, so I'm going to be trying to answer those when I can throughout the video. Someone asked, how did you get into digital illustration? I have been drawing my whole life. I was always the kid drawing in class, and my dad was actually a tattoo artist, so I just feel like I was born into the life of artistry. Growing up, I always drew with charcoal, pencil, and ink, and I went to university and studied something completely different than art. I got my bachelor's degree in geography and sustainability. And as a part of that, I took GIS classes, and one of our classes was all about how to use Adobe Illustrator for creative map making. I realized that I could draw digitally on the computer, and I don't know why this never fazed me, or I never thought about where graphics ever came from, but it was like this eye-opening thing. So I would actually stay in the lab for hours late and just try to draw things on the computer, and it was really, really hard. That led me to get my first Surface Pro, a Windows laptop, and try to draw with a stylus. That was actually when I first used Adobe Fresco back in the day, which was pretty clunky and hard to use. And from there, everything just snowballed. I ended up upgrading to an iPad and just fell in love with digital illustration, and now we're here and it's my full-time job. One thing that you'll see is recurring throughout my work is I use these really thick strokes. So I take my same line art brush that I've been using and I turn it all the way up to somewhere between a 50 and a 70 in size, and I make these really big grass strokes, and I use that to kind of fill in empty spaces that I don't know what to do with, but it gives it a lot of depth and adds some contrast using that negative space. I then like to go in with an eraser of the same brush in a slightly smaller size and just create little eraser marks all throughout that grass just to give it some depth, and then I'll add some color in there as well. This is one of the many recurring elements that I always come back to, and I just love it because it provides a lot of depth, and having that little bit of a darker background sort of visually brings some of the main elements to the forefront and makes them stand out. Now, some people will argue that you do not need vector brushes for everything. And while that is true, I must say that I just really enjoyed the process of drawing with them for my personal art style. So however you make art, your style is going to be a lot different than mine, and you may want to lean into some pixel brushes to kind of, you know, have a more painterly look, or you just do your line art a little bit differently, or you like the more gritty look. And that is totally okay. Personally, for my style, I really like to lean into precision and really clean lines, and I like to get pretty detailed, so vector files are great for all kinds of reasons. But the process of drawing with vector brushes is so awesome because I love that I can zoom super far in and not have it get pixelated. I mean, that's just huge for me. Now that I've been drawing like this, if I go and try to use a pixel brush that kind of looks similar to my main line art brush that I really like, I cannot handle how pixelated it looks. It just drives me nuts. So this is a lot of personal preference here. Use whatever software you want to use, draw how you want to draw, but I'm just here to share with you why I love it so much and my process. I'm just going in and finishing up my line art, at least enough of it to be able to start filling in some flat colors. A feature that I love to help me get started on colors is that when you upload a photo into Adobe Fresco, it will automatically create you a color palette based on that image. So if you have a color palette you'd really like to use, or you just want to refer back to the colors that you've used in a previous drawing, just go ahead and upload a photo and that color palette will appear. Here's an example of where you upload the picture. I'm just putting in a picture of an old drawing of mine, and it'll say color palette created. And then where you select your colors, you'll automatically find that color palette created for you. And even if you delete the image right away or cut the layer, that color palette will still be there for the rest of your drawing process. This is a feature that I think is so helpful, and I wish I had known about it sooner than I did. When it comes to color, I like to work from back to front, so I'm just starting with some of this background grass in a cool teal color, and I'm not worried about drawing inside the lines because those other elements are going to be filled in on a layer that's on top of this background color. Now I am selecting my layer that has my line art on it, and I am setting it as a reference. This is going to allow me to fill in all of my flat colors using that line art layer as my reference while adding the colors to a different layer to keep them all separated from my line art. You're basically just going around and selecting areas that are enclosed by your line art that you want to fill with the color. So you need to be filling in those open spaces, and if you accidentally click on your lines themselves, you have to be careful. You will fill in all of your line work as well. So you can see that I turned my line art layer off and all my line work has turned this blue color that I was using. So a pro hack, if you realize that you did this and you want to get rid of all of that line art that you accidentally filled in, just go back and use the vector trimming tool. So go to the layer, turn on your touch shortcut, and slice through that color and give it a second to load. That's a lot of strokes to delete, and it goes ahead and deletes it all. So there is a hack if you ever notice that you've accidentally filled in your line art layer and you didn't mean to. And say hello to my cat LA. She needs to be the star of the show, so I'm sure she'll be making frequent appearances in these videos. Now I'm just going in and adding some details all throughout my drawing. I'm using my same line art brush, just in a smaller size, and adding some fine lines throughout all of my leaves. And the main reason for saving this step until after I lay down my fill colors is because if I would have done that prior to coloring, I would have had to fill in each of those spaces with colors, so it's just a little bit of a time saver to do some of those details after I've already filled in the colors. And as I'm working on adding in all these little details, I am hopping between all kinds of layers. So I'm working on some things that are mostly in the background and then some things that are in the foreground, and just making sure that I keep my layers organized so that I kind of know where I'm going to be adding in different details and different elements. Now, if I was working on a t-shirt design or another design for a client that was going to be used on a product, I would be separating out all of my colors onto their own layers, but because this is a full detail illustration that I'm going to be selling as an art print and there are a lot of colors involved, I am not separating out every single color. I just organize my layers in a way that works for me, usually having one layer with most of my base colors on it, another one for highlights, the background, and just keep it organized in a way that works good for my drawing process. Now I'm just going in and adding highlights all throughout my drawing, and I have fallen more and more in love with color over the years. As far as like laying down on my base colors, that's all right. It's fun to be able to choose which colors I want to use, but I really feel like the highlights and shadows are what bring it to life, and I have this very graphic style of drawing that seems simple when you're watching me up close, but then when I zoom out and look at my drawing from afar, it looks like it has so much depth and life to it. So I just really love how these highlights and shadows just bring the whole thing to the next level. Okay, so somebody asked, how do I create a portfolio if I am just getting started? And truthfully, that's just about making art as often as you can. Believe it or not, I actually had a lot more time to draw before it was my full-time job. I know that sounds wild, but after work at my previous job, I would just dedicate like several hours a day to drawing. And I know not everybody has that, but if you could even just carve out, 20 minutes a day or have a weekly ritual for you to get creative, you just have to be extremely committed to your creative practice, and over time you're going to build out more of a style and enhance your skills, and from there the portfolio will showcase itself. Okay, so the last thing I'm adding to the top half of this piece are these little light flares that are kind of a recurring theme throughout a lot of my work. So I just put some circles in the sky and then turn down the opacity, and it gives it kind of a cool mystical look. Okay, so now that I feel like my illustration is pretty much done, I'm going to group together all of my layers and create the reflection on the water. So this is something I've never actually done before, so we're gonna experiment a little bit together. You could also just merge all of your layers into one layer, but I personally would rather have them as a group. That way I can go in and still work on the individual layers and keep them all separated. Now that I've grouped all of my layers, I'm going to duplicate the layer group and then take one of those layer groups and use the transform tool to go ahead and mirror it from top to bottom. Now I'm just moving it and adjusting it to where I think I want it to be a good reflection off of the water. And then in the transform tools, I'm going to go ahead and use different features like skew and distort to sort of distort the perspective of that mirrored reflection as well. And one thing that I find really useful is that I can move my art off of the artboard, especially for something like this. And don't quote me on this, you guys can let me know in the comments, but I don't think you can do that in Procreate. It's been a really long time since I've used the app, so I'm not entirely sure, but I love being able to have images and move things off to the side. So now I've just lowered the opacity on that layer group and then used the lasso tool to trim off the excess to sort of frame that mirrored section where I want it to be. For years, I have almost exclusively been using vector brushes, but I've just been starting to get really into the live brushes that are offered in Fresco, and the one that you see here is the watercolor brush, which has been a go-to for me recently. I know it looks a little whack right now, but just trust me and trust the process. This is going to look cool. So I've gone over my water with this darker green in the watercolor brush, and now I am going to the smudging tool, and I'm actually using it in a graphite setting. I don't know why, I just love the way that it blends. It kind of looks a little bit more gritty and grainy to me. And you can adjust the size of your smudging brush in different settings within it. So just find what works for you, and you can go in and just blend out whatever live brushes that you've used. So I have been loving this to create different shadows and highlights throughout my work. It just comes out looking so soft and blended, and the live brushes have a different look than the pixel-based brushes. To me, they don't appear to look super pixelated or low quality at all, so I love pairing them with my vector work. So as you can see, I'm going in with different colors and brush sizes with that watercolor brush to just create some depth in the water reflection. I'm using a lighter color to show the reflection of the moonlight on the water, and going in with some darker on the sides and making it a little bit more streaky to show movements in the water. And then with the smudging brush, I'll go in and blend it out a little bit more. And I love to blend and use the smudge brush to like blend horizontally, if that makes sense. So you can kind of blend in circles to smooth out a whole area, or you can do what I'm doing here and like smudge out lines, if that makes sense. And you'll notice that I haven't been too worried about keeping my blended work inside the frame of my illustration. I've just been kind of blending outside the lines, and that is because in just a minute we're gonna go in and add a clipping mask, which will take all of those blended layers and keep them confined to our illustration. Now I am just grouping all those blended layers together and then merging them together so that they are one layer, and making sure that that layer is on top of where I want it to be masked. Then I'm going to hit that clipping mask button, and as you can see, now all of those blended watercolor brushes and everything that I used is only on top of that reflection of the water and not outside the frame. One note about this, if you create a clipping mask where the top layer is pixel-based, like in this example where I used live brushes, it will convert the entire clipping group to a pixel-based format, even if the bottom layer was originally created with vector brushes. That said, a vector layer that's been converted to pixel-based still tends to look higher resolution, at least in my opinion, compared to a layer that was created from pixel brushes from the start. Now I'm going back into the main part of my illustration and adding in more of this blended look to kind of give it a foggy night sky vibe. And I'm turning on a grid just to help me visually. I'm going to be blending out this fog kind of along the horizon and some wispy lines, and I just want to make sure that they're straight and along the horizon, so kind of following those grid paths. And as I'm blending this out, I'm using a pretty bright and white color, but I know that I'm going to be playing with the opacity of this layer a bit and making it more translucent to blend into that background color. I am pretty stoked on how this has turned out so far. I think I'm just gonna call this one Reflections, and I know that probably sounds so basic and obvious, but I feel like there could be some cool double meanings, you know? Like maybe this dude is out on a night walk and he's just really deep in self-reflection. But yeah, we are about 99% done, so now we're gonna head on over to Adobe Illustrator to wrap this up. Alright, so I've gotten a lot of questions about this, so I just want to clarify what makes Fresco and Illustrator different from one another and why I personally use them in conjunction. Now, Fresco is meant to be paired with Illustrator, which is why it lacks some of the features that Illustrator has, like advanced text options or working in paths. Fresco is meant for a more natural feeling illustration process, and I think it's okay to just use it for what it's best for. Fresco allows you to draw in a more realistic way. The interface, tools, and features are a lot like Procreate, except for it has the option to use vector brushes, which can be really, really useful. Not everyone needs vector brushes, but if you do, it's an awesome tool. I think if you're someone who wants to draw on your iPad, but you want the features that Illustrator has, then you should just use Illustrator for iPad. Fresco and Illustrator are different for a reason, and they offer a different user experience. Okay, so to get our file over to Adobe Illustrator, we're going to go to Export, Publish and Export. You can name your file, and then you can choose from a variety of file types. I find that PDF or PSD works just great, and then I just airdrop it to my computer. Another option is to open a copy, so this will send your file straight to Adobe Illustrator if it's open on your desktop. In theory, this is the easiest way to get it into Adobe Illustrator without having too many files on your computer, but I find that sometimes it doesn't work for me, but it could just be my iPad or my internet connection, so try it out and see which method works for you. And to keep all of your layers intact, you'll hit Convert Layers to Objects and select OK. Once I have an Adobe Illustrator, I just make some minor tweaks. I'll recenter my design if I need to, maybe tweak some colors, and then I also zoom in really close and just scan over my whole design while I have it blown up on my monitor, just to see if I made any mistakes. I almost always find a mistake, whether I forgot to fill in a color or I drew outside the lines, and I can just fix those in Illustrator if I need to. This is also where I go ahead and add some watermarks or my logo throughout the design, because people really do be stealing art out here these days, and it sucks. I usually like to put some on a surfboard, just feels like a very natural place to put my logo, and I'll put my initials throughout the design as well. And from Illustrator is where I'll export all of my final files. So I go to Export, Export for Screens, and then you can choose from a variety of file types that you want to export as and export them all at once. This is where you'll find the option to export as an SVG, PDF, etc. All right, well that was my full process and how I go from something like this to something like this. And I ain't making a dang dime off any of this, at least not yet. So if you feel called to support, you know, a like, a subscribe, a comment, all of that really goes a really long ways. And also another way to support me is that you can head on over to my website. I sell art prints of all of my work, and I have a pretty cool line of merch too. I'll give you the spin. Well, that was a fail. All right. Cheers. I'll see you in the next one.